Karl Barth, one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century, said, "To preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other." And I have tried to take that advice seriously in my preaching, except I don't actually have a newspaper. I get the news on my phone, get updates regularly, and when I listen to CBC in the car. But it's been hard to listen to the news lately, especially the last few weeks. They've been very rough. This past Tuesday, 2 teachers, 19 children, were gunned down at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. A week before that, 10 people were killed and 3 wounded in a racially motivated mass shooting in Buffalo. So far this May, there have been almost 50 mass shootings in the United States. But that's not all that's going on. Earlier this month, floods in Manitoba forced Indigenous people out of their homes. Last weekend, 11 people died as a result of that destructive storm that just tore across Ontario. Tens of thousands of people are still without power. And climate scientists say that we should continue to expect more weather events like this due to climate change. And of course, lurking in the background, Russia continues to invade Ukraine, where more than 3,000 civilians have died in the fighting since February. There are many other stories in the news that I could share this morning, but the question I'd like us to ask ourselves or wrestle with this morning is, what do we do with all this tragic news? What is the faithful response of the church? And to help us explore that question, I'd like us to just take a look today at our story from Acts chapter 16. I like Paul. He's a good guy. But in this instance, he is not at his best and brightest. Just imagine for yourselves, if you were walking to church every day, your place of prayer, and you passed by someone who essentially every day was begging you, asking you for help, and every day you just walked on by. Until one day you finally get so annoyed that you finally help them. Not because it's the right thing to do, but because you just can't take it anymore. It kind of reminds me, I don't know if you know that parable Jesus told of the widow and the unjust judge. The widow keeps pestering the judge day after day for justice, and finally the judge is worn down and gives in and grants her justice. In that story, the judge is not the hero. And in this story, neither is Paul. Paul's going to the place of prayer, a good place to go, a nice place to go. And no doubt he's going to be doing some praising and some praying and some preaching about Jesus. All of that's good stuff. But he wasn't paying attention to the community in which he lived. He was too busy, we call it navel gazing, to see what was right there in front of him, and he failed to see this woman and her situation. She was both a slave economically and spiritually. And like the widow in Jesus' parable, she is just crying out for justice. And Paul failed to notice. Failed to notice, that is, until it started to affect him personally. And so, when it comes to that question, our question for this morning, what to do when faced with injustice in the news, the typical response, like Paul's, is to usually ignore it and just continue on our merry way. ignore it as long as we can until it starts to affect us personally. And that's why those who face injustice have to protest. They have to disrupt and disturb to get themselves heard. Otherwise, it's too easy for us and our governments to ignore them. And so if you ask me, the hero of this first act in our story is this possessed woman because of her persistence and her determination and her disruption of those like Paul who are comfortable and complacent. The first thing that I think this story is calling us to do is to seek justice. Pay attention. Pay attention to the stories of the marginalized, the oppressed, and the downtrodden in the news. Look at those stories. Do not look away. We need to let ourselves be disturbed and annoyed into that place where we are finally willing to stop what we're doing and act. Because sometimes just going to your place of prayer isn't enough. So Paul drives this spirit out of the woman, and she's made whole again, and everybody's happy. Well, not everybody. Because here's the thing about injustice, is that injustice's roots always run deep. So Paul and Silas have really stepped in it now, because once they healed this woman, once they started to pay attention to the injustice around them, that's when the whole system of injustice gets up in their face. The system of injustice that kept this woman in chains gets exposed and irritated in a number of ways. First, Paul uncovers an unjust economic system where the owners, but then quotes, owners of this woman find that their means of making money has just gone up in smoke. And they're angry about it. You know, when doing the right thing, the just thing, threatens people's pocketbooks, people will go to great lengths to stop it. I think you don't need to look much further than the gun lobby in the US or the world's dependence on Russian oil. But the uncovering of injustice doesn't stop there. Next, they're dragged in front of the courts, and the accusation is not, oh, they healed somebody, let's put them in prison. The accusation is, these Jews are advocating unlawful customs. What Paul and Silas uncover next is racism, xenophobia, religious bigotry, all that is baked into the systems of law and justice. If you want contemporary examples, think of the black community and how they're unfairly targeted by police. Think about how indigenous people are disproportionately represented in our prison systems. Think about the removal of a Muslim teacher in Quebec for wearing a hijab. All those point to the systemic injustice in our institutions. And it's so difficult to untangle those things. And just as justice is often delayed for Muslims and indigenous and black communities, justice is delayed for Paul and Silas. There is no justice for them. And then they uncover this last sort of injustice in our story, which is misinformation. Why did the crowd just all of a sudden start joining in the mob? They were stirred up by the false allegations that these men leveled against Paul and Silas. Misinformation was in their time, it's in our time too, and it seeks to mislead people and to blind people to the injustice being done in our midst. It's what Russia is doing with their um, with the misinformation about Ukraine, justifying their attack. It's what's happening in the South when politicians give credence to racist ideas like replacement theory. And it happens in church. It's what the church did for years around residential schools, hiding from the reality of the harm that was done. The point of that, uncovering all these different injustices I'm trying to make here, is that when we encounter injustice in the news, when we start to tug on one of the strings of injustice, like Paul did when he healed that woman, we need to be ready for what unravels. Because there's no easy fixes to many of the injustices that plague our world. And there will always be great opposition to any attempt to disrupt the status quo. Justice, Paul is learning, takes perseverance and grit. As a pastor, I sometimes worry that I haven't spent enough time in jail. You can laugh at that. But it seems when I read the Bible, many of the early disciples, that's where they end up. And certainly that is true for many who fight for a more just world in our time. So Paul and Silas are there in jail, and you'd think that that would be incredibly discouraging for them. But instead, we find them singing and praying. Even in the face of so many injustices that they have endured, they do not lose their faith. So they sing and they pray in the darkest of places. And that's a reminder to us that when faced with tragic and unjust stories in the news, it can be so easy to get discouraged and say, it's too big. But we must bring our faith to bear and let our hope be renewed through our faith. Because if this story tells us anything, it tells us that God is not silent in the face of injustice. Things happen. And so we need to bring the full force of our faith to bear on these stories in the news, stories that we encounter. And when we do that, God will make things happen. Chains of oppression break. Doors of injustice blow wide open. And not even, in the story, not even the oppressors are able to resist the love and righteousness of God. What I love about the story is that instead of trying to escape, instead of letting the jailer kill himself, Paul and Silas speak up and spare their jailer's life. Because in God's just world, even those who are part of the systems of injustice, and we're part of it, are worth saving too. So now here's the important part. And this is the part I overlooked in my first read of this story. We have a role to play in the stories that we hear in the news. And so yes, Paul and Silas are there and they're singing and praying, and God is doing something amazing in their midst. But they also use a special gift that God gave them. Today, we would call it privilege. I suspect that's a word that you're becoming more familiar with in our society. It's popping up here and there. When we talk about privilege, we're talking about the unearned advantages that society affords us. And for me, a white, cisgendered male between the ages of 40 to 45 living in Canada, I've got a lot of privilege. I don't experience discrimination because of my sex, my gender, my sexual orientation, my race, or my religion even. That is privilege. And that is something that we can use. It's something we must use. Paul and Silas also have a privilege in their culture. They are Roman citizens. In that time, you could buy your Roman citizenship. And so they were Roman citizens. And man, it would have been great to just see the jaws drop of the magistrates and the police when they learn what they have done and that these guys are Roman citizens. I would love to see them as Paul wields his privilege to expose the systemic injustice that he and Silas have endured. What a sight it would have been just to see them coming, begging for Paul's forgiveness. Don't get us in trouble. Just go away quietly and this will all disappear. We are all privileged in different ways, and it is powerful when we use it. And when it comes to the stories in the news, we're called to use our privilege, our position, to give voice to those who are ignored, those who are silenced, those in our culture who are dismissed, the unprivileged. That's called allyship, when we come alongside and we give voice to the voiceless. When we identify with those who are oppressed and marginalized, like Paul and Silas in the prison there, they're alongside those people. When we identify with those suffering injustice, we can use that tool of privilege to make their voices heard. So when it comes to answering our question today, what is a faithful response to the stories of injustice that we hear in the news? The experience of Paul and Silas tells us, one, pay attention. Pay attention, and we can't just bury our heads in the sand. Two, the story tells us that we must anticipate resistance as we advocate for change. Number three, we need to keep faith. We need to trust that God is good and God is righteous. And four, we need to use those gifts that we have, our privilege, our position, to bring about real change in our world. But there's one more thing that I think is part of a faithful response to the stories we hear in the news. And it comes from that last verse in today's story, where after Paul and Silas are released from prison, they go back. They're told to leave, but they don't. They go back to their church community. And it says that they encouraged the community of faith there. And so that's what I'd like to close with, a few words of encouragement. To say that the work of justice is going on right here in our midst. Life and Mission Committee is seeking ways to support and connect with Indigenous peoples in our region. We are collecting money to support relief efforts in Ukraine. The session is discussing how to better welcome and include LGBTQI persons in our community. The board has taken seriously the need for sustainable energy, environmental justice, as evidenced by our solar panels on the roof. And next week, a few people from Gale are going to be attending a local presentation about social isolation among seniors and how we as a church can help. All that is just to say that sometimes it's easy to get discouraged when we read about the news and the problems of injustice can just seem insurmountable. But there is hope. God is on the side of justice and those who seek justice. And though it may be long, as Martin Luther King said, the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. And so this morning I invite you in those news stories to pay attention. Don't be discouraged. Have faith. And with God's help, we will continue to work for a better world. Amen.